Вы к такому привыкли, а вы сдохли. У вас есть 30 секунд на размышление.
Сюда пойди! Сюда ко мне! Сюда ко мне! Сюда ко мне! Сюда! Быстро! Быстро!
The brutal war in Ukraine is mercilessly advancing. The soldiers of Kiev began a new day with the impetus to regain lost ground and rushed into battle. The roar of artillery shook the ground, and the first bursts of gunfire crossed the air. The local troops responded immediately, but something strange happened. The enemy's tactics and fighting style seemed different. At first, the Ukrainians thought it was a new Russian unit. However, when it came time to engage in hand-to-hand combat, the truth began to reveal itself. The uniforms bore unfamiliar insignia, and the adversaries' features did not correspond to those they were used to seeing on the men from Moscow. Finally, they could notice the foreign language, and the answer became clear. Someone shouted, "They are not Russians, they are Koreans." In this new military force video, we'll learn all about the North Korean fighters who have joined the conflict supporting Russia, and we'll seek an answer to a big question. What would happen if Kim Jong-un's army defeated Ukraine? Stay with us and find out.
11 тисяч частина цих військ вже брала участь в бойових діях і проти українських військових. Так, є вже втрати. Наступний крок, якщо ми не будемо застосовувати відповідну зброю і політичний тиск на Російську Федерацію, наступний крок може бути набагато більше використання північно-корейського контингенту.
The words of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speak of the reality facing his country's forces, but also of the fear of the future. After having resisted for more than 2 years of brutal war against a superpower like Russia, the presence of North Korean soldiers means a new and complex challenge. According to intelligence reports, Kim Jong-un's government has sent between 10,000 and 12,000 fighters to reinforce Vladimir Putin's troops, especially in the Kursk border region. Although these North Korean warriors face integration difficulties, such as language barriers and differences in military training, their capabilities, especially in artillery, are a factor that could complicate Kiev's efforts on the battlefront. Ukrainian High Command told its government that North Korean support could have a significant impact on the war, not so much because of their experience, but because they would help Russia avoid a new internal mobilization and maintain its defensive lines. In the face of North Korea's contribution, which could have turned the tide of the conflict, President Zelensky was critical of the lack of response from his allies.
Була сьогодні також окрема доповідь ГУР та Служби зовнішньої розвідки щодо північно-корейських військових на території Росії. Вже 11 тисяч в Курській області. Ми бачимо збільшення північнокорейців і не бачимо збільшення реакції партнерів. На жаль.
The president feels that his country is fighting alone against two of the West's main enemies, who are strengthened in a potentially lethal alliance against the forces of Kyiv. Consider this scenario. North Korean and Russian troops are silently deployed along the Kursk border. They await the first glimmer of dawn to launch a fierce attack. The front has been constantly bombarded by Ukrainian positions, which are trying to resist the pressure of an offensive that seems endless. Throughout the night, the new arrivals from North Korea have grouped themselves in strategic sectors, bringing with them not only artillery, but a steely determination, hardened by years of training in their homeland. The North Korean soldiers advance in rigorous order, led by commanders who swore to carry the honor of their homeland beyond its borders. The battalion moves with precision while deploying devastating fire against the positions of the men from Ukraine. These warriors who represent Kim Jong-un's ambitions do not see war only as an opportunity to strengthen their country with foreign alliances, but also as a just cause that they must fulfill at any price. They open their arms to brutality and death. Without the support of allies in the West, Ukrainian troops try to counter the advance of this foreign army, but the challenge is increasing. The forces are constantly reorganizing to launch a counterattack on the positions that the North Koreans are capturing step by step. However, even though local soldiers open fire with everything they have available in their arsenal, the enemy is used to resisting under extreme conditions. Life in a country ruled by a totalitarian and cruel regime has prepared them to face the demands of any scenario. Beyond hunger, cold, or fear, they continue forward. When the fire ceased, the North Korean fighters again launched themselves with relentless brutality to continue their attacks. In city after city, Ukrainians struggle to resist, but continue to fall to the Putin-Kim alliance. Where there are no buildings to shelter in, the fierce fighting moves into the trenches. These labyrinths of mud and suffering are filled with gunfire. The humidity of the early morning soaks into the soldiers' bones, while the air is impregnated with the smell of gunpowder. This has become the scene of direct and desperate confrontations, where the distance between life and death is reduced to a knife's edge. As North Korean and Russian soldiers seek to advance, the faces of Ukrainians reflect the determination of those who defend their land to the end. They know every inch of these trenches and fight with astonishing ferocity against their rivals. However, foreign enemies do not falter. Their military training has prepared them to resist and face any adversity with inflexible discipline. North Korean fighters move with calculated and precise movements, their discipline making the difference by creating a human wall, almost impenetrable, against each counterattack by the men from Kiev. The determination of the Asians is implacable. Regardless of the tenacity of the Ukrainian soldiers, their enemies are willing to make the necessary sacrifices to win, and once they succeed, it is time to continue on to a new position. Finally, the Russian troops that fought for more than 2 years to conquer Ukraine managed to take control of strategic positions thanks to the help of the North Korean soldiers. The local resistance has been definitively broken. One by one, the men from Kiev retreat in horror. Putin celebrates the victory, while Kim Jong-un enjoys the beginning of a new world order where his country gains ground to be able to challenge the great enemy, the United States. But before reaching a point where the war crosses borders, Kiev's allies would have the opportunity to heed President Zelensky's call and change history, starting with NATO.
The Republic of Korea, a close NATO partner, briefed the North Atlantic Council and our other Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, on North Korea's growing involvement in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine.
Seeing a growing threat from North Korea's intervention, the Atlantic Alliance would begin to take measures, one of which would be to provide weapons. NATO would equip Ukraine with cutting-edge anti-aircraft defenses and long-range missiles, capable of responding to enemy artillery and destroying rival positions from long distances, but that would not be all. A war package would include additional equipment such as modern tanks, combat vehicles, and more ammunition. Kiev would be helped to confront both Russian forces and North Korean soldiers. In addition, more combat drones and missiles could be sent to reach targets in areas occupied by Moscow and its allies near the border. In addition, intelligence assistance would be added to the weapons. This is a key resource from which NATO can intensify satellite and aerial surveillance, allowing the Ukrainians to anticipate the movements of their adversaries. Enemy positions would also be shared in greater detail to plan extremely lethal attacks. These actions are part of a commitment made publicly by the Atlantic Alliance.
NATO allies will continue to support a free and democratic Ukraine, because Ukraine's security is our security. Today we discuss the need to further strengthen military support to Ukraine.
These statements undoubtedly open the possibility of a global escalation of the conflict, where the coalition between Russia and North Korea would be further strengthened with the aim of confronting the various representatives of the West. A clear example of this has to do with another measure that NATO would implement: sanctions against Kim Jong-un. Severe restrictions would be imposed in key sectors such as energy and finance. Naval blockades and embargoes on strategic exports would also be measures considered to weaken North Korean military support. Faced with such a scenario, Moscow would go a step further in its relationship. While the Kremlin would benefit from the large volume of personnel in the ranks of the North Korean army to replace its losses, the Asian country would have access to the necessary tools to expand its influence.
Putin is providing North Korea with military technology and other support to circumvent international sanctions. This underlines the importance of democracies standing together to uphold our values and to face our shared security challenges. But the deployment of North Korean troops to Kursk is also a sign of Putin's growing desperation. Over 600,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in Putin's war.
At this point, there remains the inclusion of one last and important actor: the United States. As we have already mentioned, this is Kim Jong-un's great enemy, and that is why Washington is concerned about any benefit that North Korea may obtain from its relationship with Russia. This alliance could strengthen an adversary to be feared for the future. This is how an expert in the field of war analyzes the link from the Asian perspective.
Bueno, gana Corea del Norte en muchas maneras. Primero, el fortalecimiento de las relaciones militares y económicas con Rusia. Segundo, por parte de Norcorea, esta guerra sirve como una práctica de una guerra real. Tercero, al implicarse, Corea del Norte gana la capacitación de sus tropas sobre el uso de armas un poco más sofisticadas que tienen en su país.
So, Sam, could this lead to the Americans getting personally involved in the fighting in Ukraine to prevent the North Korean threat from growing? Allowing a victory for its two great enemies is the last thing Washington needs, which is why it sends its troops to the Ukrainian plains. The first objective is the devastated region of Donetsk, now in the hands of the enemy coalition. The local troops have withdrawn after suffering numerous deaths, but after feeling crushed, hope is renewed with the arrival of the Americans. The fall of Kyiv was near, but the response was fast and forceful. In a brutal operation, American soldiers together with NATO allies begin to deploy in the border areas of Ukraine and Poland. Paratroopers descend on the west in an attempt to stabilize the front and protect civilians who were desperately fleeing the enemy advance. The command of the new and implacable resistance carries out the mission with a calculated strategy to stop the advance of the Russians and North Koreans. The only objective is to recover the key terrain, no matter who gets in their way. The American forces advance towards the combat lines, coming face to face with the North Korean troops in the ruins of a desolate city. The first wave of fighting is savage. Kim Jong-un's men, known for their iron discipline, respond with a fierce defense. The confrontation in the urban terrain transforms the streets into a hell of rubble and smoke, where every building is a trench and every corner a potential ambush. While blood flows in different directions, another NATO team leads rescue operations in the occupied districts. The mission is to evacuate the groups of civilians caught in the crossfire. As they advance, a column of North Korean soldiers intercepts them, but only to receive a quick and effective attack in response. The number of casualties for the Asian country soars, and the fierce fighting between the narrow streets and the collapsed buildings begins to weigh on the invading army. With the progress of the American forces, the spirit of the Ukrainian troops resurges. Together with their new allies, the soldiers of Kyiv resume combat with renewed determination. They face the North Koreans, who try to defend the captured positions with stoicism and skill, but the fight has reached levels of violence and sacrifice that are unsustainable for them. Soon the list of recovered cities increases noticeably. The conflict that had become a confrontation of global scale begins to slowly die down. These are the possible scenarios that could arise from the participation of North Korea in the war in Ukraine, something that is already a fact and is not far from becoming a turning point for the conflict that keeps the planet in suspense. Whether as an accomplice to a victory for Russia or a decoy for the intervention of US forces, fate can take different directions from this point on. Instability will be the protagonist during the next months of the battle, which beyond any outcome it ends with will be remembered for its cruelty and the indelible mark of terror it has left on the history of humanity. And now, after exploring the paths that the presence of North Korean soldiers in the brutal war in Ukraine could lead us to, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to meeting you again in our next military force video.